Sports. I'm your host, Jon O'Donnell, and we are live from the Dream Big Studios recording this podcast. Thank you for listening and thank you for downloading. I really want to ask you, if you enjoy this podcast, get out there from where you found it, give us a like, a favorite, throw us a comment, get on our website, go to the live chat, give us some ideas on what you think about the show, on my opinions, and on what you might want to hear in the future. We really want you to be part of this show. Also, you can find us on Twitter. We are at Cinder Sports. You can find us on Facebook. We are at Cinder Block Sports or Cinder Block Sports on Facebook. Today's show is going to have a really good interview. We're going to be interview heavy today because Steven Johnson, an author of A Walk in Our Cleats, which is a story of 25 NFL players and how they overcame some adversity in their personal and professional lives, is going to join us. And he gave us a good amount of time. We got some great comments, some great discussion back and forth. So that's going to be most of the show today. I want to start today, though, talking about the UFC on ESPN. This was an event last weekend, and it really was the first kickoff, if you will, of ESPN's relationship with the UFC. The UFC is now exclusively going to be on ESPN, and ESPN Plus, ESPN streaming service, seems to be relying on the UFC as its crown jewel for content. ESPN Plus is a very good resource. It's a very good streaming service and has a lot of good events already, especially in college sports. There's a lot of good, what I would call niche or off-the-radar sports, tennis, baseball, hockey, that's already out there on ESPN Plus. And if you're a college fan, it's already a great investment from a streaming service perspective. However, I think the UFC is really the crown jewel in terms of attracting a national sports audience. National professional sports audience. The UFC has gained popularity in leaps and bounds in the last 5 to 7 years, and ESPN is hoping that by adding it to its ESPN Plus service, it'll get lots of eyeballs and lots of subscriptions. So this weekend they kicked off with a card that had 6 main event fights. It's a little different than normal. Most cards have 4 to 5, typically 5, but I think the 6th fight was an idea just to get more people watching for longer, and they were all very good fights. The undercard was featured on ESPN Network, so you could tune in live on your TV and then switch over to, well, you could use your TV if it was app-enabled, or you could switch over to your phone or iPad or other tablet or viewing source of streaming video. So the UFC fight itself, I thought, was fantastic. But before I get into that, I want to talk about the relationship between Disney, who owns ESPN, and the UFC, which has battled the persona of being human cockfighting. And look, I don't believe that stereotypes are always right. Matter of fact, they almost never are. But there's a reason they exist. Stereotypes exist because, in part, they're based on truth. And that's true with the UFC. I was personally exposed to the UFC at a pretty young age. UFC 1 and UFC 2 were shown on VHS tapes at the national training centers that I was at for table tennis. And yes, I was at national training centers for table tennis. We'll talk about that another time. The point being, these videos were being watched by people who appreciated the brutality and the viciousness and the antithesis that it served to boxing with its rules and its weight classes and its promotion. This was just 2 guys getting out there and beating the crap out of each other until one of them submitted or one of them was knocked out. There weren't a lot of rules. No eye gouging. No crotch punches. Don't call the other guy's mom a bad name. That was about it. Outside of that, it was everything goes. No holds barred. And again, the appeal was the viciousness of the sport. You had guys out there that just looked like barroom brawlers, just beating each other up until one of them stopped. And then you had Royce Gracie. Royce Gracie was a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. He really redefined what martial arts, in many people's minds, is. I'm not going to say he was Bruce Lee. He wasn't that, but his influence lasts in the UFC and in mixed martial arts to this day. Royce Gracie won UFC 1 and UFC 2. The Gracie family, well, the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu is still a discipline in mixed martial arts, a very important one. And the Gracie family continues to fight in mixed martial arts. They are a legacy family, and it started with the UFC. But the UFC business model wasn't going to survive, at least not on a national scale, just appealing to people who wanted the viciousness, the brutality, the blood. That wasn't going to work. So Zuffa, who purchased the UFC years ago, set out to make it a little bit more like boxing in two regards. One, we're going to have weight classes. We're going to separate these guys out so they can have titles to fight over, and it's going to be a fair fight in terms of size and weight. And two, we're going to promote these fighters not quite like boxing, where the promoters really were the attraction. Don King comes to mind, but Bob Arum and other promoters, if you're a boxing fan, you know the promoters were pretty much the stars. Not anymore, not in the UFC. The stars were the stars, and that's when I became a fan. Chuck the Iceman Liddell was a fantastic boxer with good defensive wrestling. He had the mohawk that was cut real short. He just looked like your barroom guy who actually was pretty technical in fighting and was fun to watch. You had other over-the-top personalities like Rampage Jackson, Vanderlei the Axe Murderer Silva, and other guys who could really promote fights and actually had a really good skill set that was outside of the standard boxing skill set. You got the appeal of not just being boxing, of being a little more rough, a little more vicious, a little more brutal, but you also had some of the better parts of boxing. And I think that appealed to a broader audience. And it clearly did. The UFC became a multi-billion-dollar company. It was sold recently for $4 billion to IMG and their sports arm. And Dana White, the president of the UFC, who I think is chiefly responsible for its growth, is still the president of the UFC under the IMG brand. And they were able to land the ESPN contract. Now my question is, how does Disney, the parent of ESPN, reconcile with all this violence? Well, I think the answer is simple. I think the UFC is not boxing. It's a little more brutal than that. But it isn't blood and guts and gore and violence 100%. It is a sport. It has really good rules, really good drug testing. And I think it qualifies in the ESPN version of the Disney brand. So I understand that a lot of people who are Disney fans might say, look, this is just too rough and violent for my children. That's not what this appeals to. This appeals to the parents who like combat sports, and I think it's marketed in a good way to have long-lasting impact on ESPN in a positive way. I think it'll be a good relationship for both. So, was excited to see the marriage take place. Was excited to see the kickoff event this weekend. And I think the UFC and ESPN got really lucky. They booked a good card. It was highlighted by Cejudo versus TJ Dillashaw for the 125-pound flyweight belt. And also on the card were some other good fights. I don't want to get into a blow-by-blow and a fight-by-fight analysis, but there were just a lot of good fights on paper on this card. And there were some really great takeaways because some of these fights really highlighted high points for the casual fan who may have been tuning in for the first time as an ESPN Plus subscriber, and for the UFC fan who subscribed to ESPN Plus because of the UFC. And if you can cross-section both of those populaces, you're in a really good place. So just a couple of quick highlights from the event. I want to start with Donald Cerrone versus Alexander Hernandez. Donald Cerrone, again, back to that UFC fan. Donald Cerrone is a guy we've known forever. He has records for wins and finishes, which are knockouts or submissions in the UFC. Alexander Hernandez is a guy who a hardcore UFC fan might not really know. He's an up-and-comer. He had two really great finishes against good fighters coming into this fight. And he was looking to be the young lion to knock off the old guard. And it was a really good fight. Alexander Hernandez, as you would expect, came coming out, throwing big punches, big kicks, trying to take out the old man. Donald Cerrone remained calm, technical, and ended up really hurting Alexander Hernandez in the first round before he knocked him out in the second. And why that's important, or why that's significant, is a casual fan saw a 36-year-old guy against a 29-year-old challenger step up and really take control and show that the veteran presence can take out the younger, maybe more talented up-and-comer. From a casual sports fan, that is a great lesson. It's one we've seen repeated over and over. The underdog beating the favorite, the veteran beating the rookie. That appeals to casual fans, and I think that's a win for the UFC and for ESPN. Again, for me, selfishly a UFC fan, it was good to see Donald Cerrone get a big win, give his beautiful 6-month-old son, Danger, a kiss in the middle of the ring, and continue his storied career with the UFC. Another fight I want to mention quickly, Joseph Benavidez took on Daniel Ortiz. This was a rematch fight. Daniel Ortiz, when he was a young up-and-comer, got schooled by Joseph Benavidez. Joseph Benavidez has been a 125-pound contender for a very long time. And I want to point out why this fight was on the card really quick, just for a little education in the UFC process. As I mentioned, the main event was a 125-pound title fight. Very often things happen at the main event level. Fighters don't make weight. There's an injury last minute. So what the UFC will do is they'll schedule another good fight at that weight class in case they need a substitute fighter. Well, luckily, they didn't need that. Both TJ Dillashaw and Henry Cejudo, they came through fine. The main event went off without a hitch. So we got to see Benavidez versus Ortiz. Benavidez, again, longtime contender, and fighting Ortiz, who had improved greatly. So the fight starts, and it's one of those things where, for a casual fan, I think you got introduced to wrestling at the MMA level and grappling at the highest level that you'll find in mixed martial arts. So I think if you're a casual fan and you wanted to tune into people beating each other's brains in, you got an education here. This was a back and forth fight in terms of wrestling on the ground, position, control, counters, but Benavidez kept getting the better of Ortiz, did the most damage, had a very successful first round, and got a unanimous decision. For us UFC fans, it was a great fight. We wanted to see how far Ortiz had improved. The answer was a lot. He looked really good. His wrestling was really good. But he was in there against Benavidez, who was one of the best MMA wrestlers, and showed it, and ended up with a decision. So again, another fight that happened to have great value to the casual fan in terms of education, and to UFC fans in terms of just a really high-quality grappling match. Real quick, again, I want to talk about Glover Teixeira, who's 39 years old, versus Carl Anderson. This happens in the UFC a lot. You'll see injuries force opponents to be thrust into action. Carl Anderson was scheduled to fight on the undercard. There was an injury to Glover's opponent. Carl Anderson graciously stepped up. And what usually happens there is the replacement fighter, Carl Anderson here, gets smoked. He just doesn't have time to prepare for the favorite, and it just doesn't go well for him. The fight starts. Glover Teixeira goes for the takedown and takes 6 to 7 massive elbows to the side of the head and goes down. And it looks like the substitute fighter, the underdog, is going to teach the old dog a lesson. But this is why this fight has a lot of value to a casual fan. You got to see Glover Teixeira, who's been in more fights than even Donald Cerrone, we talked about earlier, rally back, establish position, and submit Carl Anderson in the first round. To me, as a casual fan, I don't know that you could see a better fight here. You saw the tide turn really quickly. Glover Teixeira looked like he was going to get knocked out. He took his time. He did what good mixed martial artists do. He found an opening, and he submitted Carl Anderson. It was just a great fight. As a UFC fan, I stand back and I think to myself, man, Teixeira made a huge mistake here. He put his head in the position to just get elbowed over and over again, but yet he was able to survive that mistake and win the fight. Now I want to get into Greg Hardy. Greg Hardy, as many of you know, hopefully, was an all-pro NFL defensive lineman for the Carolina Panthers, and then, very briefly, for the Dallas Cowboys. I want to go into this history of Greg Hardy really quickly, and I want to be very clear. The reason I want to go through this history is because I think it illustrates what Greg Hardy is, and that is a terrible human being. I think Greg Hardy is a violent human being who does harm to people when he doesn't need to, and for that should probably be in jail, but because the criminal justice system isn't, and while he's found himself to be a very talented fighter in the UFC, that despicable nature that he has shows through yet again. Greg Hardy was convicted, let me repeat, convicted, of beating and throwing his ex-girlfriend onto a bed of loaded guns in their North Carolina home. He was convicted of that crime, guys. There's no doubt. There's no question. Now, he was convicted by a judge, and under North Carolina law, he's allowed to appeal that conviction to a jury. Well, for whatever reason, and I don't want to speculate, I don't want to ever get into victim blaming here, but for whatever reason,